often face dilemmas about teaching how I play or teaching how I would like the students to play. It's a difference which is subtle, but it's a consciousness thing. For me, I like them to be informed, especially when the respect for them is to give them the choice, but also to guide them through the choices. As a performer, I don't have to explain my choices. I play them didactically through the interpretation, so to say, which hopefully is not didactical. I mean, you don't want to have people guess where the bar lines are when they hear your phrasing that arches way over that. Um, and that the notation doesn't always correspond to, and far from there, often to the intent of the composer's line, drive. I find it also important, therefore, to inform the students about the fact that in the left hand of most of the fortepiano music from the early 19th century, since the pianos were straight strung in the construction, you had different ranges between the basses, the middle, and the top, if you want, which had incredibly different characteristics in terms of colors, timbres, orchestral, like woodwinds, strings, brass, for instance, as sections of a symphony orchestra. And I find that in that case, the homogeneous resonance throughout the ranges, which is achieved by the cross-strung instruments of today, and which resonate by sympathy, even for the keys which you're not pushing, but it has this rich tone that allows to have a rounded sound and relatively homogenized through all the ranges. Um, that's an advantage. But at the same time, then we have to find out how to translate the octavization of left hand bass lines in Schumann, in Chopin, in Beethoven, in most of the piano works where they don't octave the melodic line, even if it's very high register, they octave the left hand to get, I guess, the depth that they would have in the orchestration between cello and double bass, which are an octave apart. So you get in orchestral feeling not so much a question of dynamic range, only like fortepiano, hence the name of the instrument for which they discovered how to compose since it was new in the beginning of the 19th century. It was more about the depth of the basses, which they wanted to restitute. And so in fact, dynamically, the ranges don't correspond anymore to the balance of the modern pianos, where if you take it texturally, honestly, in the desire of authenticity, then your octaves sound way louder in the left hand and they overpower the melodic line of the right hand on the modern piano. When in his time piano, a Beethoven, a Schumann, a Brahms later, would like to reestablish the balance by bringing more basses. So in fact, you cannot then take off the note and say, hey, on the modern piano with the richer tone and the length of sound before decay, which is enhanced, I don't need to octave. Of course, we cannot change the notes, but we could shape the voicing. And I think very much about that as a solution because in a way it's like a sculptor um, um, shaping the material so that we translate the intent on the newer instrument on which it was not intended to be played on. And re-establishing the balances between the ranges while acknowledging the root cause. Now, it's not for sure that all composers wrote octaves in the left hand because of that. It's just that it seems to me clear when you look case by case in sections of late Beethoven sonatas, attributed often to his deafness or so, that he could hear the outer ranges. So you had an exponential expansion of the two hands playing in the two edges of the keyboard. But it could be also for dynamic reasons, but mostly psychological reasons. The idea, forceful idea of Beethoven, es muss sein, was his famous motto, which meant in Deutsch, in German, it has to happen, it must be. And so sometimes, in any case, we only suggest, I do, for the students how to bring all these, but by voicing, in which case you could shadow the bass lower one and play louder the octave on the top, so that you have the depth without to have the overwhelming disbalance. And then in which case, then you'll have to play the melody louder to make up for the louder octaves in the left hand. So if I play, I could very well decide, and I take it on me, but I cannot do that responsibly and respectfully of the students and say, okay, do like me, don't play the octave. If Beethoven was alive today, with this piano, he'll say, I don't need to dub it. Or perhaps he wouldn't say that, and it's pointless to even start guessing in this kind of impossible fact of playing music of another time for our time on our instruments. It's a paradox, but it's a fact that we have to adopt, and proclaim that we are respectful of the text, as well as the teacher is respectful of the student. And that is one aspect which I think it's a dilemma, because more than ever, the back and forth between the publisher and the composer, in the past between the engraver and the composer, didn't go that far most of the time, some more than others, but music had to be generated daily. It was an inevitable necessity of survival in the 18th, 19th century. And so ephemeral situations happened often, and the publications were not musicologically fine-tuned, perhaps by lack of time. So it leaves room for debate. How much some of the details are discrepancies, unnoticed, unguessed by the copyists or by the proofreaders of the publishers or the composers themselves, who also were allowed to change mind. So it creates a sense of multi-layered authenticity search through urtext, the original text, where we can assume certain things. To give you an example, I have often noticed that in the early classical to romantic era, basically late 18th to mid 19th century, and even a little later, in Europe, especially in Western Europe, the music written by the great composers, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Brahms, Liszt, Chopin, and more, encompass the fact that the texture of their writing corresponds to their soundscape imagination, symphonic or quartet or aria of an opera or an aria of a just lyrical aspect. And the piano, or in the pianoforte or forte piano, was the sort of in between. You can sort of suggest the orchestration through the texture that you give to different ranges. But most of the time, in terms of mysterious openings like the Liszt Sonata, low register, or other situations, whoops, somebody's major third. That was certainly not Beethoven's piano. Had a very interesting factor that Liszt Sonata writes pianissimo for the opening scales, and pregnant rest independently separated by a single note, almost like a sigh. And in the lowest register, the keyboard of the action of most of pianos is heavier than on the top. And the beginning of the Waldstein Sonata in Beethoven's chordal accompaniment pattern, which becomes for him an all-encompassing thematic material as well as the pulse rhythmic material, it's in the low register also starting piano. And most of the pianists fear about not having enough sound projected, that they might have some holes. in the projection of the sounds, because the keyboard is heavier in the low register, and most of the low register notes have to be played softly. And the piano manufacturers still today make the piano's action always heavier in the bottom. It's most likely to do with the physics of the construction and the fact of the instrument's action, but perhaps it can be to a certain extent modified so that it can bring a more comfortable, if not more reliable, capacity to play soft in the low register when the action is heavier. And it is not only two examples, there are a plethora of examples like this. And I still think that in that case, we have to think about playing it perhaps less soft, but more harmoniously full of its juices. It's one thing to start a piece mysteriously or distantly. Another thing is to be fearing it or to be cautious fearing. It's not the same projection. But that obviously didn't matter to the composer pianists who wrote such awkward ways for the action of the instruments, as if they ignore the limitation, if not the specificities. Of course, that's the best part of a creator. They don't have to write according to what they have. They are visionaries. They imagine these marvelous structures, these orchestral pianos, regardless how much they could really play it like that or not. And then comes, of course, the connection with the acoustics and the tempi and what was the purpose of a pulse, of an indication. Sometimes you get contradictory indications, and that you have to find a way to translate it to the student. Another dilemma is the slow section in C sharp minor of the Wanderer Fantasie by Schubert, which is in 4/4 with chords that are quarter and 2/8 notes, exactly the same rhythm as the Beethoven A minor, it's Seventh Symphony's Funeral March. And starts like that, then he moves into variations that go into 16th notes with a melodic line of the aria with dotted 8th notes. And then you have a furthermore 30 seconds. So he obtains a rhythmic accelerando until he decelerates through sextuplets of 16th notes. But this time in major, in a sense of relief. And so he's using the different pulses, unique pulse for different group of amount of notes that fill it in from a single to 8 through 4 or 6. And nevertheless, the indication of the meter is cut time, C with a slash, which means that you think by half notes, you have a larger step. But he indicates adagio, at ease in Italian, or slower metronomically indicated than andante, which would be walking. So if you write adagio in 4/4, it cannot be in 2/2 cut time. It's a contradictory thing. Or is it to say adagio, andante, un poco adagio, as some composers write. I like to call it andagio, because it feels like it has to be both walking while also taking the time to taste the beauties of the piece. As if you walk in a garden and you smell this, you taste that. So it gives an impression that the composer gives an indication through the terminology adagio, another one through the pulse, the cut time. Of course, the conductors conduct, the performers perform. The pianist is the conductor of their own performer. And so you have to take in account this kind of discrepancy on the get-go. Like, how come you can have a cut time adagio? Of course, we all know by experience, and students discover it, since it's by essence the teachers have the experience and the students don't. But of course, that's also a give and take exchange situation, because after all, a fresh pair of eyes and heart, and they see things without perhaps all the analytical obstacles that I have seen already through it. But most of us know that when you play a slow movement, you tend to slow down. to lose the tempo. And if you play a slow movement, not too slow, you tend to keep it running. Haste it without haste. An elegant traction. So much to do with the texture itself. Of course, when you have a single note, a beat, or 8 in the 30 seconds, it changes the busyness of the story. But I still find that, of course, the metronome was marketed by a Viennese mechanical toy maker for specialties in wind-up toys. Melzel, who had a Viennese shop in the 1820s, they say the window of it, the display window, was always an eye catcher for the latest craze of a toy that has the human-like mechanical action. And he marketed the metronome, which Beethoven purchased. But Schubert, I don't know that he did. It's all written at that time period, late 1820s. And there is no metronomic indication of the number of beats by the pulse for the metronomic indication. Therefore, Schubert only gives us the mood, and then in the choice of the meter, he gives us the traction. So how do you translate that to the student? Go ahead, take your time, it's adagio. No, think of it in large steps of 2 half notes rather than smaller steps of 4 quarter notes. But that is in theory. What about the melodic line, the harmonic projection, the fact of the development of the sound extraction of the fortepiano with deeper sounds in the low register? And there is a moment where your intuition guides you more than your knowledge. And that's so beautiful and humbling. You don't always feel like a translator from another time period where the audacities of the time disappear, and today you find out that you can produce something more driven and perhaps more ultimately rich in tone with the modern piano that you think, we think, I think, it has more sound richness than the fortepiano of the time. But that's not true. In fact, no, it was marvelous for then, and it's marvelous still today for those who play it. There's a different way of thinking of it too. Length of sound, tempi dictate more about, the choices are dictated to you by the instrument. Whenever on the modern instrument, you can stretch things beyond the natural expectation of what was a cut time adagio in Schubert's mind that day of late 1820s. But see, if I don't take all these things at heart, then the teaching becomes only a recitation of a score, and there must be some innuendos in the choices of the indications of the composers. Perhaps not, perhaps random, perhaps meant to mitigate. I know somebody like Ravel writes in his indications often a double negation. Like, for instance, in the Sonatine, he would write, surtout ne pas ralentir, don't slow down, the get-go, assuming you would. So it's already a negative indication rather than a positive indication about what to do. Here it's rather what to avoid intuitively, but therefore no. Yes, but no. The more I teach, the more I'm puzzled by the responsibility. How to inform, how to explain, how much to inform and how much to explain in order to leave also the beautiful room for the student's intuition, its own, his or her own experience with the piece's meaning, storytelling, psychological traction, its pulse, its possible rubato, or perhaps rhythmical accelerando according to the specific rhythmic patterns. The teacher shouldn't be there only to say what not to do what to be aware of or what to fear because of personal experience, it should be also, okay, I don't think of the piece like you, but it's very valid. Let us go further in your vision of it and see where it leads you, how you structure the meaning of the sentence, the arrival points, even if stretched in a slower tempo, the legato, the over legato, the pedal, or little or less or more, not too much. If you have staccato in the left hand and held sounds in the right hand, you have to tend to find superstition, no, um, I call it superstition. That was a slip of the tongue. It's fingerings where you change on the same note in order to have more fingers when others are occupied. Substitution, rather than 5 5 5 5 5 on the top of the hand with pedal, which is a good foot glue, but if you can do it finger legato, then it becomes a finger pedal. And you allow for the rest of the texture to be contrasting if left hand, for instance, has pizzicato imitation staccatos, while the right hand has legatos and an inner voice of thirds doing something else. Polyphony layers, it's all about how it sounds natural. And when you play it, it seems complex. And if you resume it vertically, it becomes simplified. In a way, it's vertical because you play two hands, but it's horizontal because you implement layers. And there is a way to combine the two, perhaps through the tempo, the texture, and how you define what to bring and what to keep in the shadows. Isn't that wonderful? To think that the pieces from the past are trees that keep on giving fruits for us, discovering them during our passage, and then next generations will do on their own the discoveries and the assumptions.